It's about time I got around to talking about these movies. The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. So The Fellowship of the Ring came out in 2001 and was part one of the Lord of the Rings trilogy directed by Peter Jackson. And this marked a change in kind of how fantasy films were adapted. Before Lord of the Rings, you had your fantasy films like Conan or Dungeons and Dragons or Princess Bride that were either really cheesy or played it up more for comedy. But Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings took a different look at what fantasy films could be and gave it that epic scale and budget and ambition that this kind of adaptation deserves. And while Peter Jackson did an excellent job with all three films in this trilogy, for the sake of this video we're just going to be focusing on Fellowship on its own, so let's dive in. So Fellowship opens up like all great fantasy tales do, with an epic backstory. It's the story of the Rings of Power, how they're given to the elves, the dwarves, the men, and the one ring to rule them all, forged in the fires of Mount Doom by Sauron, the evil one. And you have this epic battle of old that broke out where Isildur, the king of men, destroyed Sauron and took the ring, and almost destroyed it in the fire of Mount Doom, but didn't. He succumbed to the temptation, and now Middle-earth is kind of all divided and all over the place. And it's here where we flash forward to the present day of Middle-earth, where we see Frodo Baggins, the future hero of our story, played by Elijah Wood, living with his uncle Bilbo Baggins, played by Ian Holmes, who's much older, and he's gone on many adventures that he loves to tell stories about that took place in the Hobbit movies that we won't get around to till much later. And the two of them are living it up in the Shire with all these other hobbits. Now, a hobbit is a freak of nature, if you ask me. They're only 3 feet tall. They have giant hairy feet, and they like to smoke and drink and eat all day and live their life free from all the worries of the world. So of course they are the perfect candidates for an incredibly dangerous adventure that could end in the destruction of the entire world. Naturally. But before we get into all that, it's Bilbo's birthday. He's turning 111 and he barely looks over, 60 or so. And that's because he's got this secret magic ring that just happens to be the Ring of Power from the backstory that he just happened to steal from Gollum in the cave. We'll talk more about Gollum in the next video. But Bilbo has it now, and he uses it just to, play pranks. It's really his addiction. He doesn't want to get rid of this ring. It's kind of driving him a little insane, but it is keeping him relatively young. But in order to make this day extra special, his old wizard friend Gandalf the Grey comes by with his fireworks, and he's played by Ian McKellen. I'm going to pause for a second to recognize the incredible casting in this movie. Ian Holm nails the character of Bilbo Baggins. He brings the warm heart and good nature that his character is known for, but he also perfectly represents what being saddled with this ring could do to a person and the addiction that grows with just having it in your pocket. And likewise, Elijah Wood does a great job at Frodo Baggins. He has the plucky optimism of someone who wants to go on an adventure, wants to go on a quest, but then when the burden of carrying this ring and the physical toll that it ends up taking on him start to show, Elijah Wood brings that pain, but he also brings the determination to move past that pain to fulfill his quest. And of course we have Gandalf the Grey, played by Ian McKellen, and he's just amazing. He may be the best casted person in this movie. Ian McKellen just knocks it out of the park. You just take one look at him with the beard and the hat and the staff, and yeah, that's Gandalf the Grey without a doubt. And I don't know anybody else that could have played that better. But during these festivities, we're introduced to some of the other hobbits that will accompany us on this journey. You have Merry and Pippin, played by Dominic Monaghan and Billy Boyd respectively. And they're basically the comic relief when it comes to the hobbits. They're the hobbits that like to joke around, play pranks, play with fireworks, get in a little bit of trouble, eat, smoke, drink, have a good time. And while their loyalty to Frodo and the mission is never in question, they do seem to be a bit less burdened with the responsibility of the mission than pretty much everybody else involved. And while you could see that as selfishness, I just see it as they've been so used to the carefree life of living in the Shire that as soon as they're removed from that, they have no idea what the expectations are, so they're just kind of learning as they go. And last but not least, of all the hobbits in the Shire, we have to talk about the bravest and the loyalist, and that is Samwise Gamgee, played incredibly by Sean Astin. Now, Sam is nobody special. He's just Mr. Frodo's gardener and best friend. But as soon as Frodo goes on this mission, Samwise steps it up in every way. He becomes more than just his best friend. He becomes his brother. He becomes his bodyguard. He becomes his physical and emotional support throughout this entire quest. And while that's developed more in the other two movies, it definitely has its start here. And it's important to acknowledge that. But alas, you can't have the festivities go on for too long because Bilbo eventually puts on the ring. It wakes up the Nazgul. They're coming to the Shire. And the Nazgul, or ring race, are these spooky looking horsemen that come in and kill whoever they think has the ring. No questions asked. They mean business. So now the pressure's on for Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin to leave the Shire and go to Rivendell so they can figure out what to do with this ring. But not before they stop at the Prancing Pony and make a little bit of a scene, and they meet Strider. And Strider's a ranger played by Viggo Mortensen, and naturally he just happens to be Aragorn, son of Arathorn. And if that doesn't mean anything to you, he is Isildur's heir, you know, the king from the beginning of the movie. So Aragorn is the direct descendant of that guy, which means that he's the one and true king of Gondor, and that he alone can unify the race of men and bring peace to the world, basically. But he gave it up because he doesn't like all that pressure, so he became a ranger and decided to wander around in the wilderness instead. Seems like a productive use of his time. So because Aragorn is a nice guy and because Gandalf is a little indisposed with his boss at the moment, Aragorn decides to take the lead and lead these 4 little hobbits that are way out of their depth across the wilderness and into Rivendell safely. But now let's talk about Gandalf for a second, because he had a meeting with his boss, the White Wizard Saruman, played by Christopher Lee. And if you thought that this would be the one time Christopher Lee actually played a good guy, you'd be wrong. Yeah, so Saruman kind of gave up the whole White Wizard of goodness and virtue thing that him and the other wizards are bound to. He completely gave his soul over to Sauron, and he's a bad guy now, but Gandalf didn't know that, so he just walked right up there, and now Gandalf's captured, but not for very long because he uses a butterfly to summon an eagle, and he got out. So now let's get back to our hobbit friends in Strider. They're going through the wilderness, and after a couple close encounters with the ring race, they do make it to Arendelle. But real quick, I just want to give some credit to Aragorn. I don't think he gets enough credit as a swordsman. This dude took on all of the ring race at the same time by himself. The hobbits weren't armed, mind you. All the hobbits kind of ducked and covered at that point. He took on all the ring race with nothing but a sword in one hand and a torch in the other, and he set them on fire, he stabbed them, sometimes he did both, and he won. Round of applause for Aragorn. Everybody talks about how Legolas is so skilled with his bow and arrow. Aragorn is an amazing fighter. So now they're in Rivendell, the home of the Elves, and they meet Elrond, the king of the Elves, and he's played by Hugo Weaving. And if you thought Hugo Weaving would finally play a good guy in this movie, you're right. He actually does play a good guy in this movie. And he actually does a pretty good job of it. And even though he does come off a little smug, he is ultimately a good guy, and he's an ally with Gandalf. And they send the word out, and they bring together a secret council to discuss what to do with the ring and who's brave enough to take it into the Fire Mount Doom and actually destroy it this time. And so we get a pretty good selection of the races of Middle-earth. We get some men. We meet Boromir, a prince-ish from Gondor. His dad's kind of overseeing the throne, even though he doesn't have the official title to it. And if you thought that Sean Bean would actually survive a movie this time, spoilers. And of course there's some elves, because we're in Rivendell after all, the home of the elves. But we get some wood elves who are a little bit different, like Legolas, played by Orlando Bloom. And he is an incredible archer, he's a great fighter, and I kind of already talked to him when I was talking about Strider earlier, so we'll just keep moving on to the dwarves. And one of the dwarves that we meet is Gimli, son of Gloin, played by John Rhys-Davies, and he's incredible. Whenever John Rhys-Davies is in a movie, he just brings such levity, but also a little bit of seriousness, and I like him in this movie especially because he isn't just comic relief here. He becomes a bit more of the comic relief in the later movies, but here he's actually allowed to have some deep emotional moments, like when this council's going on, but also later in the Mines of Moria when he realizes his entire clan had been wiped out from goblins or orcs or whatever. And that is a pretty heart-wrenching scene delivered by an amazing actor. But as you can imagine, when you get all these personalities together, tempers run hot, and they have all their own opinions about what should be done. So of course they all start bickering and arguing and causing a scene. Frodo, the little surprise that he is, offers himself to take it to Mount Doom. And that shut everybody up real fast. Because while they're all talking about their own virtues and their own prejudices, you have this little person, literally, who steps up and puts ego aside and sacrifices his own life, presumably, in order to complete the quest, to do the right thing. And that is one of the lessons to take away from in this movie, just to humble yourself. Do what needs to be done to serve the greater good, not because of the fame and accolades you'll get from it, but just because it's the right thing to do. And his act of bravery does not fall on deaf ears, and everybody else kind of quiets their mind, and the fellowship gets formed. And that fellowship consists of 4 hobbits, 2 men, a dwarf, an elf, and a wizard. So now they're off to go to Mordor to drop the ring in the fire of Mount Doom from whence it came. And they're making some pretty good progress. They're going across country over fields and mountains and all kinds of stuff. But Saruman, the white wizard that betrayed Gandalf, he's been hard at work making a new breed of orcs, the Uruk-hai. And I honestly really am not sure what an Uruk-hai is, but it's basically just a alpha orc. It's an abomination of nature that makes orcs nearly indestructible. And he's hard at work at upgrading Sauron's armies from orcs to Uruk-hai and making weapons and tearing down trees and all kinds of horrible stuff. The Saruman's doing more than just that. He actually impairs the way of the Fellowship, so now they have to go into the mines of Moria, which is incredibly dangerous. But Gimli's not scared because, he's got family down there, except, like I said earlier, they're all wiped out. So that's a little unfortunate. So they're by themselves and they're fighting off goblins and orcs. And really quick, comment below. I honestly can't really tell. I've seen Lord of the Rings probably about a dozen times, and I couldn't tell you the difference between a goblin and an orc. I don't even know if these two pictures really represent the goblin and orc. But comment below if you know the difference both scientifically and also just visually. How can you tell the difference? Because I can't. But regardless, they go down into the mine, they fight their way through orcs and goblins and trolls, and they find the Balrog down there. And this is just Satan, right? Like, they go down into the earth, basically into hell, and they find fire and death and this demon-looking thing with horns and a fire whip, and that just has to be a Satan allegory, right? There's no other way you could really interpret that. But even so, the Balrog is probably the coolest and most visually interesting monster that we ever come across in Middle-earth. And I'm a little sad that no other Balrogs show up in the other movies, because that is just such a cool design. So Gandalf makes his stand against the Balrog, does the "you shall not pass." The Balrog falls to presumably his death, but at the last second he ties his whip around Gandalf's ankle and pulls him down with him. And now we come to the part that really just kind of drags, in my opinion. And this is both in the extended version and the theatrical version. It's when they're all mourning Gandalf's loss, and it is warranted, mind you. Gandalf is one of the most important figures in this whole series, and they all think he's dead, so yeah, there is a time for that. But then afterwards they go and meet Galadriel in the forest with some elves, and there's this whole prophecy thing, and they meet her, and while she is played well by Cate Blanchett, even though she does have her whole bipolar blacklight scene that's a little out of nowhere, I don't know, maybe that is what Gandalf warned Frodo of when he offered him the ring. But I don't know, for me, this whole thing with the elves, I feel like it could have been cut. And aside from a few pretty important gifts that are given to the Fellowship, like that star that lights up in the darkness that Frodo has, you could have cut all this and it really wouldn't have mattered. But what comes next matters, because that Uruk-hai prototype that Saruman made has his first big mission, and he leads an army of orcs right to the Fellowship to kill all of them and bring back the ring. And it's here where Boromir has more character development in about half an hour than he does throughout the entire movie, because he actually succumbs to the temptation of the ring, and Frodo puts it on, it leads the orcs right to him. And it's here where Boromir has a real chance to redeem himself. He fights side by side along with the hobbits, and he ends up sacrificing his own life so that Frodo and Sam and everybody else can live. And he takes, like 3 or 4 arrows before he ends up dying. And that is determination. He gets stuck, he just keeps on swinging that sword until he stops breathing. And that Uruk-hai prototype tries to go toe-to-toe with Aragorn, and you know what happens when you try to do that. decapitation. That's what happens. So even though they did successfully fight off all the orcs, the Fellowship really is destroyed. It failed, technically. Gandalf got taken by the Balrog, Boromir's dead, Merry and Pippin got captured by the orcs, and Frodo and Sam went off on their own to finish the quest by themselves. So even though the Fellowship did kind of fall apart by the end of this movie, the mission is still very much alive. Like I said, Frodo and Sam making their way to Mordor to drop it in the mountain, and you still have Strider, Legolas, and Gimli all together that are going to rescue Merry and Pippin from the orcs before they eat them. And that's pretty much where the movie leaves us. It's a cliffhanger, and it makes you really want to just pop in the next DVD and keep watching them all, but I had to get this video out to you guys. That's pretty much my thoughts on Fellowship of the Ring. It's a great start to an amazing trilogy of movies. Peter Jackson really knocked it out of the park on this one. And it's really hard to pick a favorite of the Lord of the Rings movies because they're all so consistently good. But Fellowship of the Ring is pretty high up there for me. It doesn't have as many battles or sieges as the other movies have, but this one has something that I think does get lost in the later Lord of the Rings movies, and that's kind of a sense of fun and adventure and going to other places, seeing weird monsters that you never met before. And that is something that is distinctly Fellowship. We see orcs, goblins, Uruk-hai, trolls, Balrogs. And as you go through the other movies, the enemies do seem to be a bit more homogenous. But I'll talk about those movies when I get to them. For now, if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content, and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. And as always, I'm Colby. This is my nerdy talk, and I'll see you in the next video.